What I'm going to ask for you to do is to do some buys for me then. Okay, where you'd have to wear a wire, you'd have to go buy marijuana from individuals, and then, depending upon how you do and so forth, a lot of this could go away.
It was the kind of place where people never bothered to lock their doors. But all of that changed in May of 2014 when Andrew Sadek vanished without a trace. His car was found parked but sodden inside, his wallet untouched, his phone off, surveillance camera not working, and Andrew himself gone. This would remain the same for several weeks, but then, only 2 months later, something horrifying was discovered in the nearby river. What followed was a rabbit hole of secrecy, lies, and behind-the-scenes dealings that no one, especially his parents, were prepared for. Because it turns out that Andrew was not just another student. In fact, he had been pulled into something far more dangerous and confidential, and something that may have actually, in the end, cost him everything. But why? Who was really pulling the strings behind this kid? And how does a small-town college student just suddenly disappear overnight? And even more peculiar, why was law enforcement at the center of this mystery? Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and in this case, the deeper you go, the more unsettling it becomes. So I think we all know of a case or two where law enforcement seems to get in the middle of some rather shady business. Well, this is one of those stories. In fact, it's probably one of the most peculiar yet. Before we begin, if you like true crime, strange or chilling stories, then please do consider subscribing, as it really does help the channel out. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Andrew Sadek. If you were to fly over the United States at night, there is one spot that might seem quieter than the rest and almost forgotten. And that stillness, that is North Dakota, a place of vast skies, endless plains, and many towns where everyone knows your name, or at least pretends not to. It is no surprise that this is the third least populous state in the country. However, don't let that fool you, because this quiet stretch of the Midwest has seen its fair share of unsettling mysteries. From oil boom towns that rose and fell faster than the price of crude, to remote farmhouses where secrets can be buried deeper than the frost line, North Dakota holds much more than just wheat and wind. In fact, here is one chilling detail for you. The entire state has fewer people than the city of San Francisco, but in contrast has twice as many unsolved disappearances per capita. And so here's a simple question for you. What does that tell you about the state's ability to solve murders and disappearances? This is the kind of place where a stranger's face will automatically stand out, and where the line between local gossip and an active investigation is paper thin. I mean, it's scenic, sure, but if you read between the lines, you'll notice corruption. And I'm not just talking baloney here, because within this story alone, there are many vulnerable questions within local law enforcement. And so, on that note, you better buckle up, because these waters, they don't just run deep, they run dark. It was on May the 1st of 2014 that something very unsettling happened on one of North Dakota's student campuses. It was on that morning, and I should say the very early morning hours, that one of their students, Drew Kugel, woke up to realize that his roommate, Andrew, was missing. Today's mystery begins in Nordgard Hall, which is a student dormitory in Wahpeton, North Dakota. Found on the northern side of campus, Nordgard services the North Dakota State College of Science. It's part of the city of Wahpeton and is found right on the Red River, which just so happens to be the border between North Dakota and Minnesota. With a population of more than 8,000 residents, almost half of the people here are students. And just by looking at this map, you can see that there is plenty of wilderness surrounding the city. It was the night prior where 20-year-old Andrew Sadek had returned to his dormitory with his friends, where they then proceeded to watch a movie together in one of the dormitory suites. They shared a few snacks, spoke about their coursework, and then eventually decided to head to bed. But when his roommate woke up the following morning, Drew realized that Andrew was nowhere to be found. Now, at first, Drew and all of Andrew's friends were not particularly worried. Andrew had a girlfriend living nearby anyway, so maybe he went to spend the night with her. But when he failed to show up to all of his classes later that day and then failed to show up in the evening, they all knew that something was wrong. The following day, Drew and his friends reported Andrew as missing to campus police. Within the hour, officers had inspected the surveillance cameras, and what they found was concerning. At 2 a.m. on May the 1st of 2014, a surveillance camera captured Andrew leaving the building. He was alone and, at the time, was wearing jeans and a Tampa Bay Buccaneers hooded sweatshirt. It also appeared that he seemed to be carrying a black backpack. Officers noted that he was also carrying his cell phone, which mysteriously had since been turned off. But what happened next, or where he went to, is almost anybody's guess, because, at least on official record, this is the last known image of Andrew alive. However, let me tell you, so much more was about to happen both in and around the community of Wahpeton, and this story will leave you shocked beyond words with many questions. Now honestly, there is so much to say here that I'm actually struggling to formulate a way to say all of it in a way that makes sense. So please bear with me here. As the news of Andrew's disappearance spread around town, many local residents and students alike all pitched in to try and find him. And of course, when his parents found out that he was missing, they were absolutely terrified. However, it turns out that Andrew had actually been harboring his own secrets in the background, which were only built by other secrets and deals made with other people, including the police. In fact, this investigation would get extremely messy for everyone involved. And so, to make things more straightforward, let's first go back in time to look at Andrew's history before we find out what happened to him. Born on November the 22nd, 1993, Andrew was raised on his family's cattle farm near Rogers in North Dakota. He was one of two children shared by his mother Tammy and father John, with his brother Nicholas only a couple of years older. However, tragedy struck the family at a young age, when Nicholas was tragically killed in a grade crossing accident near the family home. This understandably had a huge impact on Andrew's childhood, and both his family and teachers alike would describe him as both quiet and shy. Andrew was known to be a very loving child, but also he never really had much to say. While growing up, he attended Valley City High School and then, after graduating, aspired to become an electrical technician. It was for this reason that he decided to study at North Dakota State College of Science, where of course they were able to provide the certification he required. Outside of school, he enjoyed lake activities, golfing, bowling, and working with electrical systems. His dreams were also rooted in his family, and he aspired to eventually take over the family farm. His mother would also describe him as a homebody, and the young man always kept his nose out of trouble, except for one minor speeding ticket. However, on the notion of staying out of trouble, Andrew found himself in hot water back in April of 2013, and that marked the beginning of his downward spiral. Now, this isn't rare at all. In fact, it's extraordinarily common. However, while in college, Andrew would step out of his comfort zone and try weed for the first time. Eventually, this was a habit that stuck, and Andrew would try weed on a semi-regular basis. He would even go as far as to sell a gram or two to his friends from time to time. But it's worth saying here that this was quite literally 1, 2, or 3 grams per sale. This was definitely not big money, and that would be the first domino to fall over because, as it turns out, one of the students that Andrew was selling to was actually an undercover agent working for Semca, a local drug enforcement agency. As a result, Semca performed a consent search on Andrew's dorm room, where they would find a plastic grinder with marijuana residue. And although Andrew did admit that the weed was his, he was not arrested or charged at the time. But then, the following day, a certain deputy would pay him a little visit, and let's just say he came on pretty strong with the possible ramifications. As a result, Andrew was taken down to the local police station to discuss his possible options, and I think it's best that I just play the tape and let you come to your own conclusion.
It's your birthday today. Probably not what you want to be doing on your birthday, huh? Alright.
As you can see in this surveillance footage, right off the bat, the officer seemed to try to scare Andrew into submission. The officer claimed that since both of these sales were made on campus grounds, they are considered to be Class A felonies. He then went on to say that Andrew could face up to 40 years behind bars with a $40,000 fine.
Alright, well, you expressed interest that you probably want to help yourself out.
Yeah.
Okay, like I said, you're facing 2 felonies, and then of course a misdemeanor charge from yesterday. 2 felonies of deliveries since they took place on campus, both of them. They're enhanced, so they're Class A felonies. 20 years in prison, $20,000 fine, and or both. Okay, so potentially the max is 40 years in prison, $40,000 fine. You understand that?
Yeah.
Okay. Obviously, you're probably not going to get 40 years, but is it a good possibility that you're going to get some prison time? If you don't help yourself out, yeah, there is. Okay, that's probably not a way to start off your young adult life and your career, right?
It was at this stage that the officer then admitted that he would likely not face the maximum sentence. However, here comes the punchline, because immediately after, he would then go on to say that if Andrew were to work for them as a confidential informant, then they would significantly reduce his punishment.
What I'm going to ask for you to do is to do some buys for me then. Okay, where you'd have to wear a wire, you'd have to go buy marijuana from individuals, and then, depending upon how you do and so forth, a lot of this could go away. Is it all going to go away? Probably not. Are you going to probably have to plead guilty to like maybe a misdemeanor possession of marijuana? Probably, but at least you're not pleading guilty to felonies. Okay, is that fair enough?
Very fair.
Okay.
The officer then immediately proceeded to squeeze as much information out of Andrew as possible. This included the information of his dealers, their arrangements, and even if any of his friends do drugs.
Well, I'll sign you up, and then it's up to you to make your contacts, okay, and go from there. You got 2 felonies hanging over your head, so we're gonna look at probably doing each individual we have to do 2 deals on. Okay, so you're gonna have to do 2 deals on per individual, and then we're gonna be looking at probably 3 or 4 individuals that you're gonna have to do. Okay.
Okay.
Is that fair enough?
Okay.
I mean, it sounds like you already got 2 for sure that you can do. It's just a matter of doing 2 more.
Okay.
And like I said, we'll give you the time to do it. Relatively speaking, I don't want it to go into the summer, obviously, and stuff.
Yeah.
But we want to. The faster we can get it cleared up, the faster you can get it cleared up. Do you understand?
I understand.
So, we just got some paperwork that we're going to do real quick, and then we'll get you rolling.
And then, quite literally within 10 minutes of beginning this conversation, he then proceeded to get Andrew to sign an official contract as a confidential informant. Not only that, but here are a few other surprising things which were said.
Do you understand that as a confidential informant that you are not an employee of the state of North Dakota, nor are you entitled to workman's compensation or unemployment benefits from the state of North Dakota, and will not hold the state liable for any injuries or damages incurred by your reason of association with BCI?
Yes.
Basically, your days of smoking weed, possession of drug paraphernalia are done, okay, while you're working with me. Now, once we're done working, if you want to go back to your old ways and do whatever, then it's just a cat-mouse game again between me and you understand?
Yes.
While you're working, you need to stay clean, okay? If you get jammed up in trouble with the police or anything, don't tell any law enforcement officers that you are associated with me, okay, at the time. Whatever you did, take your lumps, and then you call me afterwards, okay, and then we'll work it out. You're going to have to check in with me every so often that we see fit. If you don't check in with me, or if I lose contact with you, I'm just going to assume that you don't want to work anymore, and then I'm just going to cut the warrants for your arrest and then throw you in jail.
Now, in the interest of time, I'll cut the video there, but in short, it is quite clear to see that Andrew was being coerced by the officer to work for Semka as some sort of confidential informant. Now, this is just an opinion here, but I have to say, the way that the officer tried to control this situation is extremely shady. I mean, from what I see, he abused his power, exaggerated the information, and then tried to rush Andrew into some sort of contract. And by the way, this was before Andrew had any chance to have any legal representation or even speak to his friends or family. And again, because this is a really important fact, Andrew was caught selling 4.5 grams of weed. Not kilograms, but quite literally grams. He wasn't some sort of drug lord, he was just a student selling a tiny amount. And obviously, it's worth mentioning, but weed is literally legal in some states now. It's also questionable if Andrew would have ever been sentenced at all, let alone probation or a brief stop in jail. And so to be threatened with 40 years behind bars, that is absolutely insane. Despite the glaring imbalance of power, Andrew would eventually agree to work for Semka. He was quite clearly shaken and scared for what any sentence, whether that be big or small, might mean for his future. And so, it is no surprise that he eventually cooperated. By the end of April 2013, Andrew had completed his first and second controlled buys, and as a result, effectively luring yet another student into the hands of law enforcement. It is worth noting here that during his interrogation, the officer told him it would all be over by Christmas. But Christmas would come and then go, and Andrew, he was still on the hook. After a brief pause over the Christmas period, he would then resume his role in January of 2014. This time, he purchased a small quantity of marijuana from a brand new dealer. But following that buy, something seemed to change, and Andrew stopped responding to Semka. Now, technically, and according to his contract, he did still owe them. He was expected to organize a second purchase from this new dealer and then snare a third one entirely. However, he would never make those buys. In the real world, he had begun to move on. He was preparing for graduation, interviewing for electrician jobs in Bismarck and Grand Forks, and had even begun to see someone new. So, you could say that his life was now beginning to bloom. However, behind the scenes, a dangerous game still loomed, and Andrew was running out of time. It was on the weekend of April the 25th, 2014, that Andrew returned to his family home to spend time with his parents. He seemed happy, and there was nothing to indicate that anything was wrong, with Andrew even spending his time to tend to the family's cattle. It was a quiet visit, the kind that offered a brief escape from the pressures of college life, and the secret he was carrying. The following night, and after traveling 120 miles back to his dorm, his mother Tammy decided to call him. This call was only a quick check-in, and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. Andrew seemed happy. Not only was he occupied with his work, but he was ready to gear up for his exams. And so, there was nothing to indicate that anything was wrong. However, unknown to her, this would be the last time that anyone in his family would ever hear from him. And as we know, only a few days later, Andrew put on his sweatshirt, walked off campus, and was never seen alive again. And so, as you can see, our confidential informant's backstory was not entirely straightforward, and this would eventually place suspicion not only on him, but also his officer and even Semka. But Semka would not react kindly either, because in light of his disappearance, they merely assumed that he had fled and left his former life behind because he didn't want to work for them. Which is entirely wild to assume, by the way, because Andrew had so much going for him. I mean, not only was he ready to graduate and had several interviews lined up, but he loved his partner. He was ready for the next stage of his life. But with Semka being Semka, their response was not to worry about Andrew's safety, but to slap 2 felonies on him instead, hoping it would eventually lure him back. But Andrew never showed up. And despite these charges, his silence persisted. Oh, and by the way, his parents were quite literally shocked to realize that not only was their son quite literally a confidential informant, but now had 2 felonies under his belt too. Now, in my opinion, it is very likely that Andrew never told his parents because he was too embarrassed to admit that not only was he taking drugs, but he was caught with them too. And of course, once the media got hold of the news, this put the police, Semka, and many others in the spotlight. Search parties grew by the day, as residents, students, officers, and friends all chipped in to try and find him. Search efforts focused on a 5-mile radius around campus, which included the nearby rivers, woodlands, and fields. However, sadly, no sign of him was found. In the meantime, his parents pleaded for him to come home, but still, there was nothing. And as the days turned into weeks, and then weeks into a month, hope slowly began to dwindle, while both fear and dread remained steady. While his friends and family were desperate to find answers, the police response felt quite underwhelming. In addition to this, as the spring unfolded, the Red River started to swell with seasonal rainfall, thus reaching its typical maximum flood height. The authorities claimed that, as a result, the conditions were far too dangerous for a proper search, but they did reassure everyone that they'd revisit the river once the waters receded. That was expected to be around 1 month after Andrew's disappearance. However, that search would never happen. Instead, almost 2 months later, fate would take a different course for them. It was on June the 27th, 2014, that a local dive team was conducting routine training exercise near Breckenridge, Minnesota, and it was in that moment that they made a chilling discovery. At the bottom of the river, they found him. Andrew's body had been resting beneath the surface all along, and after being identified through his dental records, there was no doubt that this body belonged to him. It turns out that this was not a simple case of merely lying low or running away. In fact, Andrew had not been hiding at all. On the contrary, he was dead. What was both very interesting and concerning here is that the authorities branded Andrew's death as self-inflicted. And that's because, after pulling his body from the Red River, they noticed that he had a small caliber gunshot wound to the head. Now, I'll explain soon enough why they think this meant that he'd ended his own life. But if you want my honest opinion, I really don't think this was the case. Nevertheless, this discovery was awful. It was also noted that he was wearing a backpack loaded with rocks, therefore suggesting an apparent attempt to weigh himself down. To some, this looked like a tragic yet fairly straightforward case, but for others, especially those who knew him, things didn't quite add up, and for very good reason too. For starters, no weapon was found at the scene, and that detail alone caused some serious doubt, because if Andrew had really taken his own life, then surely it would be nearby. After all, a body cannot dispose of its own weapon. But then came another curveball, because, as it turns out, the family's firearm was now missing from the farmhouse, and so the authorities assumed that maybe Andrew had stolen it and then used it on himself. But then again, if that were true, then where was the firearm? Because surely something that heavy would now be at the bottom of the river. There is also the question of motive, because Andrew seemed to be quite happy. And by the way, toxicology reports would indicate that there were no drugs or alcohol in his system at the time. His friends and family would also confirm that, in the days leading up to his disappearance, Andrew seemed happy, upbeat, and there were no warning signs whatsoever. He had a lot going on for him, like I said before. He had friends, family, graduation was coming up, and he had multiple interviews lined up too. There was no reason for him to want to take his own life. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to this surveillance image. Take a close look at the clothes he was wearing on his way out, and how easily recognizable they were. Well, it turns out that they were not the same clothing his body was found in. In fact, the clothing found in the river were not his at all, because nobody recognized them. His key personal belongings, which included his wallet, were also missing from the scene. And his parents did not recognize the backpack either, so it likely didn't belong to him. No surprise, but the more that these details unraveled, the murkier things became. The theory of him merely taking his own life began to feel increasingly forced, and almost convenient for the authorities, wouldn't you agree? Either way, law enforcement stuck to it. However, you can probably guess that this evidence left far too many questions unanswered. Now, let's talk about the car, because I believe these details are widely understated. After Andrew vanished, his family picked his car up from campus. Now, to begin with, nothing seemed out of place, and all was fine. And then they opened the trunk. The carpets inside were thoroughly soaked, and as for the spare tire well, that was covered with several inches of standing water. Now, of course, this could be explained in one of two ways. Either A, the car had recently been somewhere extraordinarily wet, or B, the car had recently been thoroughly cleaned. To Andrew's family, this was not a mere water leak, and appeared that the vehicle had been through some sort of extreme condition, before then being washed and returned to campus as if nothing had happened. And for those of you who are thinking that maybe this theory is a stretch, get this. It turns out that, on the night Andrew disappeared, the surveillance camera looking down at the car park and his vehicle was either turned off or disabled. And to make things even more suspicious, it turns out that someone came forward to say that they saw 3 people cleaning a car, which looked eerily similar to Andrew's vehicle on the very night he disappeared. So, let's just paint the picture here. There is a car which is soaked in water, the driver has disappeared and ends up dead. The surveillance camera looking down at the car is magically not working that night, and only a few hours later, there are reports that 3 people cleaned it. Does this really sound like an accident or self-inflicted to you?
We can't begin to grieve. It's still so fresh, and we don't want other kids to go through this.
In this developing story, Tammy Sadek is fighting back tears as she talks about not having answers in her son's death. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christine Stanwood. The Sadek family is bringing their own attorneys to the fight, and now they want the FBI to investigate. Their son, Andrew Sadek, was found dead in the Red River near Breckenridge nearly 2 years ago. He had been working as an informant for a regional drug task force. Today, the family is asking the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension to turn the investigation of Andrew's death over to the Department of Justice. The Sadeks continue to believe their son's death was a murder.
Quite understandably, Andrew's parents were furious with the system and the multiple entities which all contributed to their son's death. North Dakota State College of Science had one clear policy. If students were ever caught violating drug or alcohol rules, then their parents would be notified immediately. However, Andrew's parents say that they never received such a phone call, not once by the college or the police either. They had no idea their son had been caught, and more importantly, they had no clue that he agreed to become a confidential informant for the police. There were no warnings, no discussions, and no opportunity to intervene. Moving forward, many people did try and help find the missing weapon. For example, in August of 2019, and while fishing on the Red River, a woman did find an old firearm. To begin with, many did speculate that the gun might have been Andrew's. However, after using ultrasonic cleansers, it was revealed to not be related. And then, a couple of years later, in 2021, two YouTubers named Brandon and Austin Kinsler would use a magnetic detector to try and search for evidence. But sadly, nothing was found, and the video has since been removed from YouTube.
Today we are down in an area we have never been to before, and we are joined by the victim's mother in this case.
Hi, I really appreciate you guys coming down here. We suspect that the weapon that killed my son is in the river here. The death is undetermined, but the officers believe it was a suicide, and I just want a little closure.
Andrew's body was found with a backpack full of rocks that was tied to him, and he also suffered a gunshot wound to the head. So with all of that said, it's time to magnifish. Let's get it. And here's the first find. Sort of the background on why Andrew got into this mess was he was arrested on campus with attempt to distribute marijuana. The cops convinced him to become a CI.
So, what are the possible theories behind Andrew's death? Well, as it turns out, there are a few. The official narrative, or at least the one that law enforcement seems to stand by, is that Andrew unfortunately took his own life. He was depressed, overwhelmed, and didn't want to work as a CI. And so, unfortunately, he claimed his own life. As you know, their theory leans heavily on one specific detail. The .22 caliber handgun went missing from the family home, and it turns out that Andrew's gunshot wound matched that caliber. So, it appears that he used it on himself. But here's the thing, they never found the weapon, and by the way, let's not forget that there are quite literally tens of millions of these firearms across the US. And so, is it just me that thinks that linking a wound to a specific pistol without any evidence whatsoever is just an absolute reach? The more compelling theory, and the one that many find harder to ignore, is that Andrew was actually murdered instead. But even then, the how is still wide open. Some people believe that him operating as a snitch likely put a target on his back, because in this world, trust is currency. And if someone found out that Andrew was actually working for the police, well, it's not hard to imagine that someone would maybe want revenge. In contrast, there are some people that believe that maybe even the police were responsible for his death. But honestly, I think that's a reach too. Now, in my opinion, it is far more believable that the police were careless or maybe even negligent or abusive. But to be outright malicious, I don't think so. To this day, Andrew's family remains convinced that their son did not take his own life. And without a weapon, without a clear motive, and with so many pieces still missing, their doubts are impossible to ignore. Because in the case of Andrew Sadek, the truth did not just disappear. It was buried underwater, shadowed in silence, and swept away by the current. In the aftermath of Andrew's tragic and mysterious death, his parents turned their pain into purpose. They did this by advocating for change, and eventually they introduced what would become known as Andrew's Law. The law, which was passed in North Dakota in 2017, was created to protect students like their son, someone who was young, vulnerable, impressionable, and unaware of the risks that they were being asked to take. Under Andrew's Law, law enforcement is now barred from using college students as confidential informants in drug investigations without first notifying their parents, if, of course, the student is under the age of 21. It also mandates that students fully understand the risks that are involved before agreeing to help law enforcement. The law ensures that there are clear written agreements in place, and, perhaps even more importantly, it prohibits the police from using non-violent drug offenders as informants in felony-level investigations. The only way around this is that if they have strict safety protocols being followed. Andrew's parents still believe that their son was pressured into cooperating with officers, and had he fully understood the danger, or at least been informed, then things might have ended differently. As a result, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit in 2016 against Richland County and Deputy Jason Weber. They claimed that Jason Weber coerced their son into becoming a CI by threatening him with severe legal consequences for minor marijuana sales, and then failing to provide adequate supervision or protection during his informant work. But unfortunately, in 2019, the district court dismissed this lawsuit, stating that there was insufficient evidence to prove that law enforcement actions directly caused Andrew's death. 1 year later, in 2020, the North Dakota Supreme Court upheld this decision, agreeing that the case lacked the necessary evidence to proceed to trial. And although there has been some progress since Andrew's death, his parents remain unconvinced by the official ruling. Sadly, with law enforcement unwilling to reopen the investigation, the Sadek family are now left with only their own efforts to find closure.
Tammy Sadek, the mom of Andrew Sadek, and as always, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris.
Our continued
for
thoughts
having
and
me.
prayers go out to you and your family.
Thank you.
My question to you is, and I'm going to quote him here, when they were talking about using college students as confidential informants, Leslie Stahl proposed to Jason Weber, hey, what are we doing here exactly? And Jason Weber said, and I quote, a drug dealer as a drug dealer, whether you sell a big amount or a small amount, whether you do it once or 100 times. Personally, for me, that was fairly jarring. Your response to that was what?
Oh, I just wanted to reach through the screen and grab him. It's preposterous. It's possession of a small amount until you sell a joint to your buddy, for instance, and then you become a dealer. It's not where the drug dealer's standing on the corner with opening up his trench coat, asking if you want to buy something. That's what I would consider a drug dealer.
If Andrew had told you that he was thinking of becoming a confidential informant, what do you think your reaction would have been?
Oh, we'd have gotten him a lawyer and told him no.
We've never heard of such a thing,
Yeah.
using college students for snitches or whatever you want to call them, stool pigeons, or I don't know, what do you call them,
And that was the story of Andrew Sadek, a quiet kid from North Dakota who got caught in something far bigger than himself. Whether it was poor decisions, bad luck, or merely a system that entirely failed him, his story has left far more questions than answers. Andrew was only 20 years old when he passed away. He liked country music, loved his family, and helped out on the farm. The young man had no criminal record, and most people who knew him described him as kind, soft-spoken, and respectful. Just a normal guy trying to figure things out. And now, all we are left with is a legacy wrapped in confusion, suspicion, and a law named in his honor. Quite honestly, I have no idea where I sit with this one. What I do know and believe is that the officer really screwed this case up with his reckless and abusive behaviour, and it seems that millions of others would agree. A lot of things just don't seem to add up for me. For example, let's go back to the car. Why was it soaking wet? And while I think about it, Andrew left the campus in different clothes to the ones that his body was found in. Does that really sound like the behaviour and actions of someone who's planning to take their own life? I mean, I've heard of people removing their clothes before death, but not switching up their outfits. I think it's safe to say that there are so many details to this story that simply make no sense whatsoever. But on that note, what do you think happened to Andrew? For example, do you really think this was murder? And if yes, who who by? Alright, I'm gonna stop this video here, but thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I really do appreciate it. Just very quickly, but if you want to support me in the channel, then please feel free to go to my Patreon here, or alternatively go to my social media, most notably my Instagram. Thanks again, folks, and I'll see you again very shortly for another video, likely in, I'd say 5 or 6 days, we'll see. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and as always, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.